Today, we're going to be replacing the wheel bearings on your classic Mini. Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, brought to you in part by 7 Enterprise. Today, we are going to be replacing the wheel bearings on the rear hub of my Classic Mini. Now, this job is something that you're going to have to do, at some point while owning this car. Unfortunately, because the Mini has smaller wheels, what ends up happening is those wheels revolve around this bearing much more frequently to travel you the same distance as a normal car would. So, what that means is premature wear on these bearings. Now today, I'm going to be installing taper rollers on my Classic Mini. Now, most Minis, when they came from the factory, had ball bearings for their wheel bearings, and since then there's been some advances in bearing technology, and now they use something called tapers. And these tapers are small cylindrical pieces of metal, and they end up creating a much more even weight distribution on your bearing, and they end up lasting a lot longer. These bearings are sold at 7 Enterprise. I'm going to put the link down in the bottom and in the card thing somewhere around here. So today I'm going to show you how to take the old bearings off, put the new bearings on, and the correct torque to torque these bearings down, because it's very important, because these are what hold your wheel on, along with a nut that mounts to the end of this thing. So let's go ahead and move out to the car and get the old bearings off. Now, before we move out to the car, there's a few things I want to touch on. One, I would have your new bearings here and ready before you start this job. Two, this job can take some time and it is a challenging job. However, it's simple, it's just it ends up being really difficult and kind of frustrating a lot of times. What ends up happening is those old bearings get stuck on your hub or stuck on the post that they mount to, and it ends up being really, really frustrating to get these things off. So I strongly recommend a puller tool. This is a three-prong puller tool, and you can get these at Advanced Auto Parts. They sell these at 7. There are tons of different kinds of these pullers. There's some with 2 teeth, some with 3. Strongly recommend having this. It's going to make your job a lot easier. In addition, I would get a good set of pry bars, which you can see in my video right back there. Those are not good pry bars, those are really cheap ones, but they work pretty much the same. So let's go ahead and get out to the car and start taking this thing apart. Alright, so as you can see, I've already got the rear wheel off here. The next step is to take this drum off. Make sure your parking brake is off, and this should just slide right off, like so. And there you have it, your drum. And now what we're looking at is your shoes and your hub here. And as you can see, mine is really tight. It shouldn't be that tight. What that means is my bearings inside are kind of binding up and need to be replaced. When you're driving, if you're wondering how you know if you need a new bearing, you'll hear kind of grinding noise in the back or like a scraping noise. Generally, that's indicative of the fact that you need a new set of bearings in the back on whatever side, or in the front. It'll make the same noises. So the next step is to take this dust cover off. So that just kind of pries back and up and off. There you have it. And so that's just your dust cap. And that covers up this nut here, which holds your whole hub assembly on. And now, as you can see in there, the centerpiece does not move. What your bearing is allowing this to do is allowing your wheel to spin while the post in the center does not spin. Now, this is a little bit different from the front of your car where the drive shaft is actually spinning. So this shaft spins and then rotates the wheel. So it's a little bit different, but same general concept going on up here. Now the next step is to take this nut off, and that's a 1-inch socket. That doesn't always come in most sets, so just make sure you have a 1-inch socket before tackling this job, and I'll go on and pull that off. Alright, so that cotter pin came out pretty easy. They don't always come out that easy, but the kit from 7 Enterprise that comes with this wheel bearing does come with a new cotter pin, so you can safely throw that away. Alright, so in addition to my bearing needing to be replaced, that nut was way too loose as well, so that's something that we're going to need to touch on once we're putting this back on. But this little washer should come out pretty easy. There you go. So that has a whole bunch of bearing grease on it. And now you're able to see more inside the hub assembly here, where your old bearing is sitting on this post, and then this rotates around like so. So if you're lucky, this whole hub assembly will come right off. However, 9 times out of 10, that is not the case, and this requires a lot more doing. So that is where that puller tool that I talked about earlier comes into play. So as you can see, this is my old bearing, old taper bearing on the front. This is your hub assembly, and it looks like both of my races are still mounted in there pretty good, which will need to come out, and I'll go into that a little bit more detail. And then on the back here is my old bearing and dust cover. Now it looks like these are going to be a little tight on there as well, and these old bearings you can pull off using your puller tool as well. Alright, so unfortunately my puller tool doesn't fit in behind these things around my shoes, so I'm going to have to take my brake shoes off, which is not too bad. It's a pretty easy job. There are 2 springs, one here, and then one on the top. So shoe number 1, spring, this is the top spring. Bottom spring, and shoe number 2. Now, if you're smart, you'll keep these in the same orientation so that that's easier to put back on later. And just so you know, this item right here is your parking brake. Alright, so now, as you can imagine, getting these things off can be kind of difficult, especially when they're damaged or if they're stuck to your post here. So what I'm doing now is taking this box cutter. I'm going to try and cut off this back seal here, and hopefully what that'll do is give me enough room to get my pry tool in there, and then I can pull off this whole bearing kind of uniformly. If that doesn't work, there are times where you actually have to cut these bearings off using an angle grinder. And I have one of those. I don't want to do that because it's kind of a pain. You run the risk of damaging other parts of your sides here, and in that case I would actually recommend taking this whole shoe assembly off. But let's try and get this dust cover off and pry it off first, and then hopefully we can get the new bearings on and it'll be a good, easier job. Alright, so what we're looking at here is our hub. And the hub has 2 races in it. That's this little silver piece right here. And there's one on each side, and it kind of tapers inward, so like slopes like this into the hub. And that's where your bearing actually sits, where the bearing face actually sits down in there. Now, when we're replacing our bearings, these need to be replaced with the bearings. You can't leave these races in here, otherwise you could run into problems down in the future. The bearing isn't mated with that race perfectly. So we'll just need to pull these ones out, and usually it's not too hard, but you can run into a little bit of problem. I like using a small pry bar, and there's some notches inside the center here which you should be able to use to get those out. Now, as you can see, it kind of popped out of my table vise. Let's see if we can get this in here a little tighter. Alright, so the easiest way to get these old races out is to take a chisel. Now, I have a flat-faced one, and I really like this chisel, and I set this down in there's a small notch down there that you can actually set this into. And you take a hammer, And you try and evenly hammer this out because there's a notch on both sides, one opposite face the other, and slowly out of the hub. Alright, so now we have the races out. The next step is to really just take a look at your hub here and make sure that there's no damage to the face on either side or any of the inner lining inside the hub itself. If you see any notching or damage inside that space right there, you're going to want to address that by getting a new hub assembly. Now, I'm looking inside mine, and it doesn't look like there's any problems down in here, which is great. I can go ahead and take my new races, put some nice bearing grease on that. Now, the bearing grease that I'm using is full synthetic, and it's made specifically for disc brake wheel bearings, chassis suspension, universal joints, constant velocity joints, basically anything that is going to get high temperature. The important thing when you're buying the grease like this is to make sure that you get the correct grease for a wheel bearing, because if you don't get the correct grease, it'll overheat, it'll not work the way it's supposed to, and you'll end up having to do this whole job again much sooner than you'd like to. So if you ordered the kit from 7 Enterprise, it does come with a nice little packet of grease here. However, I just like a little extra, but you can see this is also grease for wheel bearings. So I'm going to save this for the actual wheel bearings themselves. I'm going to use my synthetic grease to kind of line the inside here to make it easier for my new races to get pressed in. Now your new race, you'll see this is the wheel bearing. It should be sitting in this race in the box. You'll take that wheel bearing out and take this race, and it's going to get pressed in. Notice the tapered side, the opening, the widest spot is going to be facing outwards. So you're going to kind of press that in with your hands here a little bit, and then take your new wheel, or your old race, and you're going to use that as the face that you're going to hammer to try and get this new one in. It's very important while you're putting this new race in that you don't hammer directly on the race, and you also do not press this in with the bearing in it. If you press this in with the bearing in it, you're going to damage your bearing, and you're going to have to take it back out and redo all of this again. Now, if you don't want to use the old race, or you're finding a difficulty doing that, you could also use a really nice large socket. The socket that I use to kind of press this in, this one's a 1.5 inch, and it fits almost perfectly around that. And you can do that to kind of press that race in as well. Alright, so that bearing race is in there, and the way you can tell that that bearing race is all the way in is the bottom side of that race is fully mated with the center step that's inside your hub. And that's going to need to happen in order for this to be seated properly. So just feel around inside here, and if there's a gap anywhere in between the race and that step there, it's going to have to get pressed in more. If there's no gap, then you're good, and you can switch to the next side, the other side of your hub. Alright, so both of those bearing races are in now, and you can kind of take a look. I'll put this bearing in here so you can see exactly how this is going to set in. But you have your new bearing here, and as you can see, the tapered, kind of the wider spot is going to be on top. The thinner, ring is going to be on the bottom and just kind of drops in there. So it's pretty straightforward, and then this is allowed to spin in there, and the race is kind of what it rubs up against to spin. Now, as you can imagine, you're going to want lots of grease on this. So the next thing that we're going to do is called packing your bearing. And now, if you have some kind of looser, older bearings, if you want to kind of put a band-aid on this, on your bearings before having to replace them completely, you can do what's called repacking your bearings. And it's where you re-add the bearing grease inside here. And it can extend the life of the bearings a little bit longer just if you don't want to do a full bearing job at the time. But I'm not a big fan of that. Personally, I think that you should just go ahead and replace the bearings because you're going to have to do it anyway if you repack them. And so I'll show you how to repack these bearings. It's pretty straightforward. And all you do is you take a big glob of the grease, press it in here, and just kind of roll it around into the bearing. And now you can see why I wear gloves. Next step is to move back out to the car and go ahead and slide these back on and see if it slides on nicely. Alright, so now all that's left is sliding this hub back on, and as you can see, I've already slid this back on. Just make sure that your bearing is facing the right direction, tapering inwards on the back side here, and then tapering inwards on the front side here. Tighten your nut back down, and the torque spec is 60 foot-pounds that this is tightened to. And so what you'll do is you'll tighten it to 60 foot-pounds, see if you can get that cotter pin through. If you can't, you tighten it farther, and then until you can line up the cotter pin and actually poke it through here. The main thing is that you do not slacken off during that tightening process. If you do, you're going to have to start all over, start at 60 foot-pounds again until you get that hole lined up with the cotter pin. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and you can kind of watch and see how that works. Right, now we take our new cotter pin. Great, so you can see that's moving freely, but this is also torqued down to your 60 foot-pounds. Now, all that's left to do is just reassemble everything, and that includes putting your dust cover back on, and then if you're taking apart your shoes like I have, you're gonna have to put those back together, and then reattach everything else. Alright, so that's it for Classic Mini DIY today. Hope you found this video helpful. I didn't cover in a whole lot of detail putting back all the kind of extra items that I took apart during this job. I really wanted to focus on the bearing itself and kind of shy away from getting too off on some sort of tangent, you know, telling you how to take apart the brakes, take apart this. If you have questions about taking those items apart, please feel free to post them in the comment section below. I'll be monitoring that and kind of trying to help you guys out in that way. Otherwise, enjoy those minis, motor on, and happy Thanksgiving.